One of the things that companies don't think about enough in these situations in terms of remediation is what business changes can we make? Because I think that could be really impactful. A really impactful, persuasive position is to say this company is different than the one who engaged in the conduct. For various reasons, we've got new leadership team, new policies, but also just our business model is different. To the extent that's possible, it can be a really impactful and powerful message.
Welcome to the Hughes Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practice Group's podcast, All Things Investigations. The Hughes Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practices Group represents many of the premier companies around the world, providing advice on issues spanning the full anti-corruption and compliance spectrum. In this podcast, host Tom Fox and members of the Hughes Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Practice Group will highlight some of the key legal issues involved in white-collar and other investigations, both domestically and internationally. We will tackle topical issues involved in investigations, as well as explore how companies can prevent and detect issues that arise in conducting investigations on a worldwide basis. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode with fan favorite Mike DeBernardis. Mike, welcome back to the pod.
Happy to be back, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Mike, I wanted for some time to visit with you about the Albemarle case. Came out in October. It's really significant FCPA enforcement action and settlement. I think multiple lessons learned for the compliance professional, for the white-collar defense lawyer, for boards of directors who need some thought leadership on when, how to self-disclose and how to remediate a compliance program. Maybe you could give a little summary of just how bad the facts were.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, this is along the lines of a lot of the cases we were seeing in the early 2020s and late 2010s, where we had instances of misconduct across multiple countries over a period of many years. So this was large number of bribes paid. We had payments through agents. Really, the schemes were pretty blatant. The charging documents point to a lot of email correspondence that didn't do a great job of trying to disguise what they were doing. And so at the end of the day, it really turned out to be a pretty good result for the company. So we're really talking about the bulk of the conduct was in 3 countries: Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. And the facts are somewhat similar with some distinctions in each place. In all 3, you had a situation where the company was using third parties to pay bribes in order to win contract with state-owned refineries. In each instance, and I'll start with Vietnam, you had situations where the agent was specifically referencing the fact that he had connections at the refinery. In Vietnam, he was referring to it as his friend or his friends at the refinery. This appears to have been known within the company, not just within Vietnam, but back in headquarters as well. And there was clear connection between the commissions being paid to this agent and the actions of the agent's friend within the refinery to benefit the company. We'll talk about, I'm sure, the fact that some of the internal controls issues that the company was facing across the board. But here there was requests to increase the commission, sort of classic red flags from a due diligence perspective. Similar situation in Indonesia, doing business with Pertamina there, trying to get a contract for a refinery. By the way, they were successful in Vietnam. So they got the contract and held on to the contract for a number of years there. Similar situation in Vietnam with individual referred to as the boss, where you have an agent that you're paying and the agent is making specific reference to people that he needs to keep happy in order to win the contract. And again, seems to have been known sort of throughout the company this was happening. It seemed to ease their conscience a little bit, I think, that they were making these payments through an agent. There's a couple of places in the charging documents where you could really see some pushback on, hey, be careful here. But then when it was sort of passed off to the agent to handle the dirty work, everybody seemed to get on board. And then in India, it was a similar situation there. An agent reached out to the company and basically said, we understand you're going to be put on something called a holiday list, which I understood to mean you're basically going to be frozen out and have to basically give away your product for a period of time to get back in. And I'm the only one who can help you stay off this holiday list. You got to pay me commissions. I know people stay off the holiday list. And then the conduct in China and UAE, which is only in the SEC resolution, is not described in quite the same detail, but it's really similar stuff. It's engaging an agent in China whose owner had a connection to the official at the state-owned refinery, engaging an agent in the UAE who was close friends with the royal family. This apparently was pretty well known from simple Google search, this connection between that agent and the royal family. So when you take a step back and look at the conduct, this is really run-of-the-mill use of agent, red flags type of conduct. Obviously, the schemes are sophisticated, but this is sort of our basic corruption 101 for use of an agent and this similar red flags.
So we got some great new language for our FCPA/corruption vocabulary. And I think everybody knows what the holiday list is now. And the thorny uncle from China. The big boss may have been used before, but it's certainly appropriate to revisit the big boss whenever you can, particularly when the big boss says, hire my friend. One of the most interesting things about this case was the self-disclosure timing. And even more interesting was how the DOJ characterized it. So you want to walk us through that? And I know you were interested in not simply the timing, but the date of the self-disclosure may have had some impact on the company's decision-making calculus.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. We're in a reasonableness standard now for what is a timely self-disclosure. And that can be daunting for a company. We know that, for instance, a period like 2 weeks is certainly timely. We've seen that be successful. We now know that a period of 16 months from the date that the company learned of the allegations in Vietnam to the disclosure was not timely. The DOJ also noted that it was 9 months from basically when the internal investigation confirmed the allegations before they disclosed. And they determined that this disclosure, even though it was voluntary and was not known to the government at the time, and it wasn't about to be leaked to the government, was not timely. They were not eligible for a declination. One of the things I did find interesting, and I think it's easy now to sort of look at this in the current context of where we are with corporate enforcement policy and all of the benefits to self-disclosure. But these cases take a long time. So we got to put ourselves back in the time frame the company was in when this all happened. This was 2016 that they learned about the conduct, the allegations in Vietnam. They investigated it up and through early part 2017. And so when they disclosed in January 2018, for most of the period of time, that period from 2016 to 2017, we were still in the pilot program where companies are still kind of figuring out. The pilot program was announced in 2016. So it was really brand new. There wasn't a ton of evidence that it was going to be super successful yet. And even in the 2017, we're still only have a couple of cases maybe where companies have actually received a declination. So the calculus was slightly different back then. And when they disclosed in 2018, I think that the pilot program had just maybe only by a couple of months been turned into a formal permanent policy. So you got to keep that in mind when you're playing Monday morning quarterback here and second guessing some of the decisions. But it provides us an outer boundary for now as to what is going to be a reasonably timely disclosure. And here, 9 months after you confirm the conduct was not.
Just listening to your recitation there, it really brought up another item or even issue that I don't think gets discussed nearly enough, but at least drove home to me. And it's the following. The pilot program was announced in April 2016. The last week of November 2017, Rod Rosenstein announced the formalization of the pilot program into the FCPA corporate enforcement policy. So literally the last week of November, how do I remember that? Because he announced it at the ACI National FCPA conference. So I know when that is. Literally about a month later, they self-disclose. But the point I don't think we talk about enough is if something happens to you in 2016 or 2017 or 2018, the DOJ in 2023 is not going to look back at that time frame and said, "Oh, that was during the pandemic. We're going to cut you some slack," or the calculus was a little different then because, as you correctly know, we didn't know where the pilot program was going to go, and that was the reason it was a pilot. And so I've always felt like you're judged in an enforcement action, not even when you self-disclose, when you settle, for conduct that could have been 5, 7, 8 years earlier. And when you went through those facts, it really struck me that they are not really giving credit to any of those questions you raised, which we were all debating literally on podcasts, in offices, and everywhere in between back then.
You're absolutely right. Now, Albemarle also got the benefit of some of those intervening policy changes, as we'll talk about in terms of the clawback provision and some of the other stuff. But even this timeline for what's a reasonably prompt disclosure, that emphasis on making sure it's really timely, that's very recent. We're talking about in the last year. And so the company's decision to self-disclose this was made almost 6 years ago at this point. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I chuckled when you mentioned the pandemic because I said that to clients a lot during the 2020, 2021 timeframe about you got to be really careful because nobody's going to care, obviously, that the pandemic was happening at this time, 5, 6 years from now.
I think you and I may have had that specific.
Yes, I think we do.
But yeah, let's move to the holdbacks, not clawbacks. And the DOJ seemed, if not persuaded, they gave significant credit to those holdbacks.
Yeah, basically what the company did was they withheld certain bonus payments to different categories of employees. Obviously, employees directly involved, I think that's a pretty easy decision just from a business perspective to hold, as long as you're able to contractually hold those bonus payments back. But then also to employees who had supervisory responsibilities, and then even employees who sort of the company held back. I'm sure you have the number at $780,000 or something in total bonus payments. And they got a 1-for-1 credit of the penalty, which is a good result. I don't know the specifics about what type of contracts they had in place and how difficult it was to actually withhold these bonus payments. I got to imagine a lot of ways it's far easier to do that than it is to try to claw back payments that have already been made to executives. But it's the DOJ putting money where the mouth is. On this case, they announced this policy and sort of immediately give credit for it. It is certainly a lesson, something to keep in mind, a data point as companies are kind of considering remediation and how to react.
That policy was announced in January of this year as a part of the new corporate enforcement policy. And Albemarle was able to get the benefit of a 45% discount off the bottom line of the applicable sentencing guidelines. Now, we don't know what the range was, but just off of the bottom line, I really estimated at $90 million saved from the 45%. That 45% was not available prior to the change. Under the old FCPA corporate enforcement policy, it was 25%. So they really, even though they were subject to perhaps a retrospective look back that was a little different than at the time of the incidents, they were able to take advantage of the new corporate enforcement policy. And it may have been greater because we just don't know the calculation as well. So I thought that part of the NPA, the discussion around the holdbacks, and then the discount were, as you said, the DOJ was really putting its money where its mouth was, or really saying, we've got this policy and we're going to follow it.
Definitely. Maybe it was an easy win for them to say, here's what this company did. They withheld these bonuses. Let's find a way to give them credit for this so that we can support our position that we are going to take this seriously. We are going to incentivize companies to claw back money and withhold bonuses. In more recent speeches, I've noticed a tendency to not just focus on the clawback piece, but on the holdback piece as well. That's important because I think it's not only easier to execute for companies, it's easier to sort of understand that we're not going to pay a bonus to these employees who engage in misconduct, or we're not going to pay a bonus to these executives who allowed misconduct to go on. It's also probably easier to implement in policies and procedures have in place that this bonus is going to be subject to certain compliance considerations. That's really good and important. And when the clawback pilot was announced, there's a lot of questions about how do we make this work? How do we marry this with employment law and various other things? And I think focusing in more on the sort of holding back bonuses is easier to implement and understand.
There was a couple of other things that seemed to garner the DOJ's attention. First of all, let me ask, they got an NPA out of this. And I have to, reading between the lines, say that a large part of that was because of the extensive cooperation and the extensive remediation. Now, the reporting in the NPA of those, I don't want to say it was boilerplate, but it was things we'd seen before. But it just struck me, given the nature of the bribery schemes across multiple business units, across one business unit, across multiple companies, with what appeared to be some pretty senior people knowing and acquiescing, I thought that was an excellent result. And I could only conclude it was because the DOJ felt like they really did remediate and they really did cooperate. Really, any thoughts on the NPA as opposed to a DPA?
I agree with you completely. Based on the scope of the conduct, the duration of the conduct, the amount of bribes paid, the amount received in return, and the executives involved, an MPA is an excellent result. I think, honestly, good lawyering, good counseling that company had, but that's not me tooting my own horn there. But really, if you look at this and you go through, you mentioned the cooperation, absolutely. You mentioned the remediation. There's a couple things in there I think that are noteworthy. And then the fact that they self-disclosed, they really did everything right, except in the DOJ's mind, waited just a little bit too long before they self-disclosed. But otherwise, they properly investigated, they thoroughly investigated, they ultimately self-disclosed. And before the DOJ even got involved, they had already started taking some of those remediation steps. So it really is a sort of game plan for obtaining maximum credit.
There were two things that were called out in the remediation I'd like to get your thoughts on. The first one was literally a change in the business model of Albemarle. They had relied on third parties, either distributors or commission sales agents, which got them into trouble. And they moved to a direct sales model. That's a huge change, number one. Number two, we don't know to the extent of it, but clearly they put in a data analytics program. And the DOJ called that out. And I wish we'd gotten a little more information on it. But to my mind, it was the first time the DOJ had specifically called out, they put a data analytics program in. It was part of the overall remediation. What were your thoughts on those two components?
Those were the two that stuck out to me as well. One of the things that companies don't think about enough in these situations in terms of remediation is what business changes can we make? Because I think that could be really impactful. A really impactful, persuasive position is to say this company is different than the one who engaged in the conduct. For various reasons, we've got new leadership team, new policies, but also just our business model is different. To the extent that's possible, it can be a really impactful and powerful message. And that certainly was here. They went from a model where they relied on agents, third parties, intermediaries to sell to foreign government customers. It's about as high risk as you get in the FCPA space. And they said, we're going to take that out. We're going to go to a direct sales model. There's still risks there, but we've learned they are easier to manage in those scenarios. And then the data analytics, we don't really know much. I think the fact that it was mentioned means that they had done something. That's sort of maybe the important lesson to learn. We've got clients all the time asking, what should we be doing? What does it mean? How do we incorporate data analytics? What's enough? And I think the lesson from this is doing something is better than doing nothing. Start to find ways, work with your very smart people to find ways to incorporate some of the compliance data you have and find ways to use that to your benefit.
One other thing I'd like to specifically call out, although we have seen it before in other enforcement actions, here the business unit was able to increase commission rates without going back to the compliance function or getting additional due diligence or contractual clauses. One of the things I tried to communicate to compliance professionals was make sure your internal controls at least notify you if there's a change in a commission rate. Even if you don't get a definitive way to say no, you're at least aware of and can investigate as appropriate.
Yeah, I think changes in commission rates is such a thorny issue, especially now. A lot of regulators, I don't want to paint too broad of a brush, look at that, not just a red flag, but sort of de facto, something's wrong here. That this has got to be a bribe. So I think it's an area you really have to be careful. I'm actually in favor and often recommend that you do, as a compliance professional or whatever your internal control structure is, have the ability to require approval of those types of arrangements and really make sure that the business justification for that change is very compelling and very well documented. In hindsight, especially, these things are really not looked at fondly.
Another thing I'd like to bring up is a colleague from the United Kingdom actually raised this to me. He said that whenever someone puts something in quotes in an email, it is guaranteed to garner regulatory scrutiny, and it's very easy to see. And so a lot of the terms we laughed about a little bit earlier, those were actually in quotes, and different types of bribery forms of payments were in quotes. I know you don't train in-house salesmen on email use, but I have done that from time to time. And I'm going to add, don't put anything in quotes in your email.
For sure. When I was a very junior associate, one of the first investigations I worked on, this was a long time ago, so the technology has changed, but we did with our vendor to find a way to add as a search term just quotation marks because I had the same exact thought. The only time that they're using quotation marks is when they're disguising what they're saying. So can we search just for that stuff? And yeah, time and time again, some of the terms, honestly, without the quotation marks, what thorny uncle, I don't think you could put quotation marks or not. I think the meaning's going to come across, big boss, the same, but certainly it's just added emphasis.
Sort of a final topic. I did a roundtable podcast on this enforcement action, and a couple of the people on the roundtable were pretty upset because they felt conduct warranted a much stronger penalty and more stringent settlement rather than what the EPA was. And my response was the conduct was terrible, but the leniency you get afterwards depends on what you do. And I felt like Albemarle had met the conditions of what we now call the corporate enforcement policy. Even in this podcast, we've called it several different things. For me, it's a clear roadmap of how you can dig yourself out, not completely, but certainly make a heck of a comeback. Final thoughts on that as a roadmap for compliance?
Not surprisingly, I agree. I mean, look, this wasn't painless. It's $200 million that they're paying out in penalties and disgorgement. Plus, this has been going on. They started investigating it in 2016 and we're 7 years out. I'm sure the legal expenses involved with that were not nothing. So this isn't painless. Aside from you can quibble maybe about the timing it took them to self-disclose. But if you are the SEC or the Department of Justice, I think in a lot of ways, this company responded in exactly the way you want companies to respond when they identify misconduct. And so there's something to incentivizing companies to respond to that. From a policy perspective, that makes a lot of sense. If the comment in your roundtable was more about, is this just, right? Is this fair and just? I think from a justice perspective, it makes sense when you've got a business, it's not an individual, you've got a business which engaged in misconduct many, many years ago, identified it, again, did everything right, put in the resources, the time, and they come out the other end as a different company. What's the benefit in hitting them harder? I don't know that there's a deterrent effect with it, and it's better to incentivize companies to respond appropriately.
Spot on, spot on. Well, Mike, as always, it's been a ton of fun, and I look forward to our continued conversations.
Thanks, Tom.